And it's another episode of the Humble Heretics Podcast. Your boy Brad, and I've got John here with me. How you doing, John?
I'm good, man. I don't know what I was just doing just now. So
I have no idea what happened right there. That was funny. So today we're going to do a little bit of the Heretics React, as it were. So we've got a couple things we want to react to. We're going to start off with a TikTok, and then we're going to respond to a little segment from a podcast on YouTube over a fairly controversial statement, which we both disagree with, and we'll tell you why when we get to that. But you're going to have to wait for that part. So without much further waiting, I'm going to go ahead and play this TikTok clip, and we will get into it right after this. Be right back.
Because in leftist veteran circles, we talk about this all the time. Military provides its personnel with guaranteed housing, guaranteed health care, guaranteed food, and schooling if you'd like it. The pay structure is tiered, so the highest ranking officer in the military only makes 10 times the amount as the E1 on his first day of boot camp. Then you get out of the military and you get a 0% down payment home loan and your GI Bill, which is different from the tuition assistance that you get while you're in. Astounding to leftist veterans that people in the military will throw around the word socialism as if it's a slur and then say they don't want to get out of the military because of the benefits that it provides. You know, the benefits that we're trying to get everyone to have. So yes, I believe that the military is the closest thing that we have to socialism in this country.
So there we have it. Socialism is the closest thing. The military is the closest thing we have to socialism in this country.
Yeah, I mean, what do you have to say for yourself?
What do I have to say to myself? You're just going to just throw that at me?
Yeah, I mean, listen, she just came in, right? And she's like, listen, it sounds pretty socialist to me. The military sounds, after listening to her, I'm like, well, there's a lot of socialist ideas there. Yeah,
but socialism is, and we'll use Encyclopedia Britannica here, socialism is a social and economic doctrine that calls for public rather than private ownership or control of property and natural resources. What property and natural resources is the military controlling? Is that our purpose and function?
Well, no, but in her defense, she didn't really say, you guys are socialists. She was just saying, you can't be anti-socialist and pro-structure on the military because the structure of the military looks like what we would expect a socialist nation to look like.
Yeah. But look at this. Everything that the people produce in some sense is a social product, and everyone contributes to the production of a good is entitled to a share in it. Society as a whole, therefore, should own or at least control property for the benefit of all of its members, right? And
sure.
And as soon as she brought pay into it, it fell apart, right?
True.
The E1 has been in for a whole 5 minutes, whereas the O10 has been in for nearly 30 to 40 years.
Okay.
Has way greater responsibility, way greater authority levels than that E1.
I don't disagree with you there.
I mean,
yeah.
On the pay level, it's ridiculous. And also, militaries for eons, thousands of years, have been doing that. They have been providing housing for the service members. The one thing I said off mic before we came in was Rome did that. Rome is one of the few instances in the ancient world where their military was a professional military. If you enlisted into their military, you had a service obligation of 20 years, not like this split up thing that we have here today in the United States where, you can do 3 years, get out, do 6 plus 2 if you're in the National Guard.
Sure.
Something like that. We have shorter service obligations here. And I don't think there's anything socialist about it, because part of her thing is you get all these benefits if you're willing to fuel the military industrial complex. Well, all that is just a network of individuals and institutions who are involved with the production of weapons and military technologies, to quote Britannica again.
Yeah.
And the military's function is to employ those productions, but they do not participate in a function of producing those things,
Sure.
which I think is critical to understand. Now, if the charge was against like 6 Hour or all these other people that actually form the research and development of military technologies, that's another thing. But the military in and of itself is the, I guess, benefits from the military industrial complex, if you would ask me.
Sure. So one thing I wanna do here as we're diving into this conversation before we get too deep, I do want to credit the creator on that. So the TikToker that we're reacting to here, because this is a TikTok reaction, is Bourbon for My Alpacas. That is her page name. You can check her out, Bourbon for My Alpacas.
I want an alpaca.
Yeah, I don't actually want an alpaca, but yeah, no, not for me. So here we have it. So let's talk about this. So I understand, like, okay, it's not a 1-to-1 comparison, right? But allow me to play devil's advocate here, right? It's not a perfect example, but we have to admit that we see the way that the military works, right? We have to admit that, like, the structure of it works. We have provisions for members of the military taken care of. They're provided housing. They're provided education. And we do that all with tax dollars, right? I mean, I just think there's a valid point to be made in there. I'm not saying that we should become socialist, but I am saying that when we look at the structure of the military and what this person is pointing out, there is some validity to the idea that, well, if it works in the military, why couldn't it work elsewhere? Because while I think, a big part of your argument is that the military doesn't have what you said, means of production, right? While that may be the case, I don't know that necessarily means that we couldn't make that work in society.
Okay.
What do you think?
Well, I mean, in society, I think you could make it work. Potentially. But the odds of that successfully happening, of having a socialist society that actually functions in the way that it was idealistically intended to function as, is damn near impossible.
Think about, so let me just bounce back on you here, right? What socialism wants to do is meet people's needs, right?
Right.
Why are we so dead set against creating a society where we just do that?
Well, I mean,
you hear that, folks? That's silence from Brad.
Yeah, that's crickets.
That's Brad stumped. He doesn't know why we can't just do that.
Why? Well, I mean, I know. I mean, if you want me to give the answer, it's not going to be the one. It's going to be the easy one, which is sinner's going to sin. Like,
it's a cop out.
How's that a cop out though? It's the
fallback answer, right?
It's the theological answer.
Yeah, but it's a fallback answer. It doesn't actually answer for the practicals, right? Like there has to be some pragmatism inside of that. Like, what does that mean? Right?
I mean,
of course, sinner's going to sin. I got you, right? From a theological perspective, of course. But from a societal structure standpoint, why can't we design a society that just meets people's needs? We have the means, right?
Okay.
So what's the problem? What's the holdup?
It's because of that inherent sinfulness of man. I mean, I think it all ultimately falls back to that. I wouldn't say it's a cop out. It's just ultimately it all falls back to that point, because the merits of a societal system, the way you organize the society, is one that the merits aren't based off of the idealism, but the outcomes, like the product that it's put out, right? And socialism, by and large, does not work. Communism, by and large, does not work.
Why?
Why?
Yes, why?
Because it's the kind of classism that it creates.
Okay, tell me more.
Well, so I mean, when you think about it, I mean, these systems, particularly on the socialist and the communist levels, you have to create a sort of this us versus them kind of ordeal, right? And you have the separation of classes, us versus them. And you have to get rid of the class somehow. You have to get rid of class system somehow in order to make any of these work, right?
Okay.
And if you come into a system that's supposed to kind of
the reason Brad is stuttering right now is because he's looking for an answer.
Yeah, I'm looking at an article right now.
Looking for a reason why we can't just, given that we have the means, give people what they need.
Yeah, I'm also scrolling through a socialism thing, so my brain is not functioning.
Here we are
on multiple wavelengths right now.
Christian men with the means to help my brother. If you see your brother, he's hungry, naked, says, "Feed me and clothe me." And you say, "Be fed and be clothed." But you don't actually give him any food or any clothes. Then your faith is dead. The Bible says. I don't know. Maybe there's some really smart person out there that's willing to say why that's wrong, but I'd be willing to bet that Jesus wouldn't have as much of a problem with socialists as most American people do. That's just me, though. What do you think, Brad? He's still looking for an answer, guys, by the way.
Would Jesus... I muted myself. I might as well just leave. You just talk. I'll just keep myself on mute for the rest of this episode.
Yep. So,
no. Dang it. Did it again.
So socialism is supposed to be a system where like you said earlier, the means of production, the distribution, and the exchange is owned and regulated by the community as a whole, right? It's a shared society, right? It's where all these means are shared, all these processes and things. There's a shared responsibility that happens inside of socialism. And I understand why that doesn't work from a mechanical standpoint. But what people are typically thinking about when they think about socialism, because most people don't have any sort of training in economics or real understanding of what that looks like, so they tend to think of socialism as, well, we just want to provide for people, and why can't we just provide for people? I understand when you say things like owned or regulated by the community as a whole, I know exactly why there's practical issues that come into play there. However, we live in a world where we can evolve beyond that definition. We don't have to stay there. We don't have to live in the definition of everything is owned and regulated by the community as a whole. Now, with that said, that is a very democratic way of thinking, just for the record. But we can evolve beyond this point. We don't have to stay in the socialism versus communism versus capitalism debate. We don't have to stay in the Marx versus Nietzsche versus, we don't have to live in these things, right? We can evolve beyond that in the conversation if we choose to, if we start having these hard discussions and saying, all right, how do we meet people's needs in a society effectively, right? We have the means to produce enough. Heck, at this point, we have the inventory. We've talked about this, right? We have the inventory to house everybody. We have the means to produce food to feed everybody. We have the means to provide warmth and in the winter and cool in the summer. Does that mean everybody gets to keep their house in 68 degrees? Probably not, right? Not in the middle of the summer, right? Does that mean everybody gets to have 1,000 square foot per person per house? Probably not, right? Those are the hard conversations we have to have. And then we get to figure out if we sincerely actually want to meet each other's needs or not, right? What happens when the answer is that Brad and John have to share living spaces, and the living space they have to share is 500 square feet, right? Can Brad and John sacrifice enough to say, I'll make that work, right? For the record, there are plenty of countries all around the world where they make that work, where whole families squeeze into 600 square feet spaces, right? We have an addiction to creature comforts in this country. We have a tendency to view our way as the only way that could work, and so we don't ever allow our minds to go outside of that box. You know, I want to get off my soapbox here. Brad is reading entire articles as we're recording this podcast, and I'm going to make him talk on the mic and answer for why he thinks that socialism can't work. Especially if it's reworked and designed in a way that actually matches up with where we are in the 21st century.
Yeah, I think fundamentally, it's categorically not good. So
that's his answer.
Philosophically speaking, because socialism and communism as social theories it theorizes about how a society can move towards this grand theme of utopia, right?
Yeah.
We kind of talked about that last week, is utopia. And so we mentioned, why wouldn't Jesus be mad about it? The issues for me here is these ideas show up in the Enlightenment period, right? And when we talk about the Enlightenment period, this is that period of time in human history where scholarship kind of moves itself from this kind of religious West idea and the celebration of reason. It kind of begins with the 17th century, which is the 1600s, and it kind of moves into like a rationalistic humanism, right? It tries to move itself beyond the scholastic period, the Christian period, the Protestant Reformation, and this is that time of period where now we just kind of have to replace religion with reason, replace religion with man. And that's where the issue should arise for the Christian with socialism and communism. And so where I'm going with this is I see the idealism of socialism, and that and the end that it wants to achieve, but being and having a system that's independent of some kind of religious motivation and fundamental regard theologically for one's neighbor is that's on the ontological level is bound by necessity to that view versus the whims of a society. And that was very muddled, but the point I'm getting at is you're a more what we might call Christian socialist approach to things is you do have something that is of ontological necessity, something that's a necessary being that informs the way you approach things, right? We assume that Jesus taught us to care for our neighbor, to love our neighbor, right? And that should inform a Christian form of justice and care for one's neighbor.
Yeah.
Whereas in these more enlightenment period ideas of socialism, of communism, and that post-enlightenment period, it seeks to replace God, and now your whole basis, epistemological or authoritative basis for doing that is the societal norms at large. And looking at it from a Christian perspective, there are times where a society is lockstep with that which is that God enjoins, and then but you can easily find yourself in a period of time where man does not walk lockstep with what God does, and so does command. And so the approach is the prescribed approach of the systems themselves is what's wrong when it's divorced of any sense of the divine injunctions of Scripture. So redistributing the wealth, moving the control to other people to a common control, and sharing all things in common, which is obviously the most one of the more common cited passages of Scripture in that regard from the book of Acts. The qualifying difference between that which is Christian and care for your neighbor and the orphan and the widow is very different. Is one is forcibly redistributing, whereas the Christian is enjoined to joyful and willful surrendering of their goods. So what that means then is today when a homeless person comes and says, winter's coming and I need a jacket, am I going to part with, my own money to clothe this man willfully and joyfully as unto the Lord? If my answer is no, and I do not do that, and I don't do that with a joyful heart and with love for my neighbor, then it's a sin. But we don't talk about that as a category of sin. We don't think of that as sin. And so I think there's a teaching issue there that's going on, and a kind of a spiritual atrophy that occurs in that. Whereas the socialism and communism doesn't assume that. And I won't say that. I would say that if you were able to get those systems to perfectly work, they would be far and above better than capitalism. But the problem is they don't do that. So
I mean, yeah, I think, I think you make a valid point in this, right? You cannot force people to share, right? You can't forcibly, take from people, right? And I think that argument is valid on a personal level. I've heard that argument before, especially in regard to private property, and people talk about taxation, and they talk about socialism, right? People talk about those things. And say you can't force. Right? Taxation is forcing me to, like, taxation is theft, right? Like, essentially, the taxation process is theft. I'm not willingly paying anything. You know what I'm saying? Like, someone's taking it before I ever get to it. If I were to evade taxes and somehow, let's just say I just put 65 exemptions on my payroll at my job, and I just don't pay out any taxes, and at the end of the year I don't file any taxes, and I wonder if Christians would say, well, that's okay because they were stealing from you. Just a side note. Anyway, with that said, my next thought is, here in this conversation about socialism, I go back to, I think, there are issues with the design of socialism as it is, but again, from a societal standpoint, I don't have the luxury, I think, of saying, well, I can only think about this from a theological perspective. I tend not to take that position because I understand that not everybody in the society is going to align with me as a Christian, and I'm not a theonomist, right? So I think
I don't think theonomy has anything to do with that.
Well, I'm saying that because if I'm the person designing the society, I can't only take into consideration what I think the right theological position is. Because there are also people who take a theological position that aligns with socialism, that consider themselves Christians, and they would disagree with that, right? Like, they would say, no, socialism absolutely lines up with Christianity, and their theological position would be one that disagrees with yours. So in that thought process, what I'm saying is, in order to move the conversation forward, we have to start having conversations about, okay, capitalism is flawed. We know that. Socialism is flawed. We recognize that. How do we move forward? How do we move the society forward? How do we move the whole of the structure forward in a way that's useful to the flourishing of humanity as a whole? And that tends to be a driving thought for me. Like, what's going to be the thing that helps humanity to flourish, right? And if you're listening and you're a post-millennialist, I think you can reasonably take that position and say, what's going to help us move forward in the best way possible as a whole, right? How do we improve upon where we are currently to get to a better place? And I think that capitalism served a purpose. I've told you that before. I think that we have run our course with socialism the same way I think we've run our course with a lot of other things. And now we are at this place of just being happy with what we have, when we need to be innovating, and we need to be thinking forward, and we need to be thinking about how to make changes to the structure of society that will make things better for the whole. Put applause right there. Just edit in applause. Just no.
See, I would disagree with that because it almost. I would agree with it and I would disagree with that. Like, should it be approved upon while we're still here? Yeah. But this existence isn't the end all be all, right?
Sure it is.
And so if that's
Christians aren't ready to have that response thrown back, like,
yeah,
we're just never prepared for like we just assume like everyone agrees. No, sure it is. This is all we have. And I'll tell you what I mean by that.
Oh no, it's pulled out of the atheistic playbook. I mean, because at that point you are left with utilitarianism.
I could pull out of the postmillennial playbook.
Well, the postmillennial playbook is about realizing the sovereign rule of God after with the consummation of the age and the gospel winning.
What's the end of it though? What's the end of it?
The end of
postmillennial position. What is the end of the thing? What is the end of the human story?
All pretty much. It's almost Christian universalism.
Let me ask you this: from really any eschatological position, right? Do humans abandon the earth?
Do humans abandon the earth?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. You believe in the rapture?
No.
Okay. You believe that humans go to heaven forever?
I think that heaven is going to be separate from this world.
Okay. You believe that Christ is coming back to the earth, is going to remove people from the earth, and then destroy the earth, and then that's just it?
Earth is going to essentially become hell.
Okay. And you think that's the end of it? Earth will just be hell for eternity?
Yeah.
Okay. I think that's a completely wrong view of the Bible. I think that any timeline that you look at in the Bible ends with humanity back on earth. No matter what, no matter how it goes, however your eschatological position plays out, ultimately, all of it ends with a new heaven and a new earth and mankind here. God made man for earth, is what I would argue, right? And in that, he has never changed that part of it. God still intends for man to rule and reign on the earth. God still intends for mankind to play out his role on the earth. God created the earth, and then he created the man, and then he gave the earth to man. And the earth is our responsibility ultimately, is how I see it. And I think that even if you have a premillennial dispensational position, it still ends with a new heaven and a new earth, and God bringing us back to the earth, and us still ultimately having to live out and play it out here.
How do you come back to the earth when it says, "And then I saw new heavens, new earth, and New Jerusalem coming out of heaven from God as a bride adorned for her husband"?
He saw it coming out of heaven like a bride adorned for her husband.
New heavens and new earth, and the sea was no more.
Absolutely. And in that,
I think there is going to be a physical reality to it. Yes, and I think you're sort of correct, but I think that's the second purpose of man.
So I don't want to get super theological here. I just want to say that into your question, I don't think that anybody reading the Bible thinks, you just said, I think there's a physical reality, right? Is your argument that we got a new planet?
We have a new creation of some sort.
Yeah. I think that the newness is just a renewal of the earth. I see no reason to believe in the Bible that that the new heaven and the new earth is anything separate from this rock that we're on right now. I just don't see any reason to believe that. I don't see any scriptural motivation behind that. If that's your position, that's okay. I just don't think there's any biblical backing for it. I think that's just something that's in your imagination, and that's okay. I got lots of stuff in my imagination, but I don't think that that's biblical. I think biblically, I don't see any motivating thought of, oh, God takes us off of the earth and then we get a new rock to live on. I definitely don't agree that earth becomes hell, but that's a whole separate argument.
Yeah. Well, that is a separate thing for another day. But dang. All right. But going back to the whole socialism thing, though, is I just don't see. Ideally, yes, that would work. If you could get it to work, and it is better, and it's the better. I think when this discussion is approached, people look at it from the what thing is the most virtuous in taking care of my neighbor, right? So the willful departing of my means to help my neighbor is greater than the unwillful separation from it, right? Whereas the unwillful separation from it is still takes care of people, but the employment of that method has never worked the way it should have in human history. And that's where the issue lies.
And we don't disagree there, which is why I always go back to moving it forward, right? Evolving and innovating. We know that historically we don't have any really useful examples of socialism being applied, right? I use the word socialism only to paint a picture, the same way I used to use the word Calvinism so that people could have a general idea of my theology. I found that not to be super useful. Maybe I should stop using socialism, but I'm trying to get people close to what I mean without having to have an hour-long discussion to explain what I mean, right? So when I say things like socialism, yeah, generally speaking, I think that socialism is the right idea. Now, there are flaws. Great, we know there are flaws. Let's talk about how to fix them. And that's where I go, right? Like let's talk about how to correct that flaw so that now we can look at, okay, what if we try this? What if we try this? Like, for example, the American political structure is not democratic. We know that, right? It's just a lie we repeat for the sake of like the world, right? It's a democracy. It's not a democracy, right? It's not a democracy. Even on paper, it's not a democracy, right? You have a very particular phrase you use, but essentially it's a republic, right? It's tell me the phrase.
We are technically classified as a constitutional federal republic.
There we go. Constitutional federal republic, right? It's not a democracy. But we say that to try to paint a picture for people so they understand what the intention is, right? Like kind of this is what we're aiming at a little bit. Democracy, right? Socialism is like that. So we're aiming at a society that's closer to a utopian position. Now, it seems that we're aiming in all reality toward a dystopian position, but we would like to arrive at a utopian position at some point as a race. And so how do we do that? What are the political structures that make that possible? What are the economic structures that make that possible? What are the societal needs to make that possible? How do we get to a utopian society? And I think that that's where a lot of this comes from, right? Socialism. If you ask Marx, right? If you ask Karl Marx, he's going to say socialism is the gap filler, right? It's a gap filler to get to communism, right? And then we have to have a whole nother conversation about the usefulness of communism. But I think a lot of people get hung up on socialism because they understand it as a society where everything is shared, where the responsibility is shared, where the food is shared, where the living is shared, where the means of production is shared, where the wages are shared. I think that's how people think about it. And I think that while that's not accurate to the real definition of what socialism is, it lets you know that that's what people are aiming at. People are aiming at a society that no one goes without, right? Everyone can eat. Now, I always like to throw in there that what that means in reality is that you, sir, who eat steak and lobster every night, would probably have to sacrifice some. You may have to go down to steak and lobster once a year. And the person who eats out of the trash can come up out of that position, right? And they can now have oatmeal for breakfast and eggs. And maybe that, right? They don't get steak and lobster either. But now we're having a more equitable experience as people. And so that's kind of where I land with that. You know, I've been talking a lot, so you can read articles and stuff. But I don't know if you have a final point on this. I think we're good to go to break at some point here.
Yeah, I really don't have much else to add. I thought we were going to stick more of the socialism and the military thing, but I think we've said
we always go off on tangents. You haven't learned that yet, man?
No,
we never stay the course of the topic. We always start at one place and end up another place.
Yeah, true. Be right back. So, recommendations. What are you thinking?
Yeah, so my recommendation today is a website. I have been using this website for a little bit, but recently I downloaded their app. So maybe the better thing to say is that I'm recommending an app. But the website is goodreads.com. So anybody that knows me knows I like to read a good book. I like to read nonfiction and fiction. I like to read biographies and novels, and I like to read sci-fi and adventure and fantasy, and I like to read all kinds of things. And goodreads.com is a website that will help you decide what to read next, help you follow up on what's going on in the world, and in the world of books, that is. And I would recommend it to you. If you have a phone, you can just download the Goodreads app. If you want to do it on your computer, you just go to goodreads.com, create yourself an account. It will help you track the books you've read. It will make recommendations based on the books you've read. It'll keep you in the know on what's popular and what's hot right now. So yeah, goodreads.com. This is not an ad, by the way. I should have gotten paid just now for that, though. That was good. Goodreads.com.
Yeah. I think I am going to suggest our drink of the day.
Very nice.
So what we have in front of us in our cups with us today is a single malt Scotch whiskey called Talisker. It is from the rugged western shores of the Isle of Skye. Comes a richly flavored maritime malt with a warming afterglow. So easy to enjoy, yet like Skye itself, so hard to leave. It's aged 10 years. It is the only distillery on the Isle of Skye in Scotland that is Talisker 10 years.
It's so good, too.
It is yummy. I like it. It's actually a good smoking, good cigar whiskey, in my
Maybe I
opinion.
should have a cigar after we finish.
We'll
see.
All right. Be right back.
Swirly.
I would
try
a little
to.
swirly.
Yeah.
Oh, you know what I wanted to talk about today?
Sure.
I want to unpack this. Abortion is worse than slavery.
This is all you. So single camera. Go.
People thought, I think people think that I was just saying this to be explosive, that I was just trying to get a rise, trying to be edgy, or what's the word? I don't know.
Provocative.
Trying to be provocative. Thank you. People thought I was just trying to be provocative, but I mean this, and I'm going to unpack what I mean by this. So first of all, a very common question is, why do you feel the need to compare the two?
Mm-hmm.
They're both injustices. I feel the need to compare the two because our society is completely desensitized to what abortion is.
Yeah.
And our generation, especially in Gen Z, has no idea how atrocious abortion is and what a human rights issue it is.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's actually really useful to say that abortion is worse than slavery because it really forces people to think. Because what's the worst human rights issue that everybody talks about? Slavery. And yes, of course, it was heinous. It was wrong. It was immoral. It was disgusting. We all know that. But once you put slavery and abortion in the same sentence, it really forces you to understand the true atrocities of abortion. I've said this many times.
Yeah.
It is the number one human rights issue that is going on in our country right now.
There was a guy who commented on that post on TikTok when I put that meme up. And a lot of people were going nuts. I forget who he responded to. But, I think it was some girl that was like, as a black woman, this is horrible. I can't believe you would say something like this. And this one guy responded and he said, 60 million plus kids have been murdered since 1973 or have, been
So that's our hot take of the afternoon. Abortion is worse than slavery, and it looks like she has a habit of doing this. Because I see here in a comment it says, "You lost me when you compared student debt to slavery." So, but we're gonna talk about abortion is worse than slavery.
Yeah.
So some people thought she was saying that to get a rise out of people, which I think part and parcel that is the case. I think she halfway admits that. And she calls it the human rights issue of today, which, I can get behind that. The issue is the category error that I see that's happening between the two. What are your thoughts on it?
Yeah. So, well, so before I get super deep into my thoughts on it, because I don't want to get lost in this, I want to take a moment to, again, credit the creator there. So this is Gina Bontempo. That's her name. Her Instagram is GM Florio, FLORIO. You're free to go there and check out what she has to say. They have a podcast, her and another gentleman by the name of Mike. Their podcast is called I'm Doing Great. So the clip you just heard is from episode 46 of their podcast. And I came across her on TikTok, and so this is a React episode. I wanted to take some time to kind of do an in-depth response to what she says here. And so the first thing I want to highlight here is the obvious and blatant kind of hot take, I guess you could say, which is abortion is worse than slavery, right? And so the question becomes, in what way abortion worse than slavery? In what world is abortion worse than slavery? How do we arrive at this conclusion? So I think from listening to their podcast, you can gather that these are folks who they're of the conservative ilk, right? They are very passionate about their right-wing political position. And so they're going to be anti-abortion pretty much across the board, I imagine, right? Inside of that there's some other things that I noticed. One of the things that's interesting, Brad, with the right-wing conservative evangelical stuff is that often one of the things I run into is that they will have these political positions and this political rhetoric, but they sell it as if it's Christian theology, right? And so it's, abortion is wrong, and it's really a right-wing talking point. They don't have any scripture that they ever really go to, I notice. But then they go, and as a Christian, I just can't, right? And it's very interesting to me because I never hear them say, as a Christian, I just can't believe that slavery ever really happened. I never hear them say, as a Christian, I believe that slavery was one of the most atrocious things that ever happened. I only ever hear them say as a Christian around their conservative talking points. And I always think that's interesting.
Yeah. Probably because they just assume it and just think it's a given.
Yeah.
And it is without need of recognition now because it's already settled and we're kind of moving past it because, chattel slavery doesn't exist in the United States anymore. So why are we still talking about it? Like it's pretty much nauseating to the political right. But yeah, that false equivocation that conservative politics is Christian theology is weird.
Yeah, it's very weird. So she's on this, tirade about how abortion, and I think the crux of her argument hinges on abortion being worse than slavery by the numbers, right?
By the numbers, yeah.
And I think that's really her whole argument hinges on how many abortions have actually been carried out versus how many people were actually enslaved, right? And so,
yeah. Which I think, to her credit, is the effectiveness of her argument.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
But at the same point, and she has to be okay to accept the category error of saying abortion is worse than slavery. Just like she can say, like saying student debt is worse than slavery.
Yeah.
She has to accept on a philosophical and argumentation level, the trade off that comes with it, that she is committing a category error to make a very, very poignant argument.
Yeah, absolutely.
But we also have to be quick to remember that slavery and abortion are sins of the same category.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
They touch on the created order and a person's humanity.
Very true.
And that is, and it makes sense because I don't think she argues from a Christian worldview. So you kind of have to assume this kind of humanistic conservative angle at it, where we have this theological one that forms again this robust foundation for how we understand things and understand the world. And part of that is that all people are created in the image of God, and despite their sinfulness and sin skewing the image of God in man, and preventing him to live the creation mandate, there's still an inherent value to man because God does say that it is good.
Yeah.
And so chattel slavery violates that on that because it denies the goodness of the person and saying you are reduced to nothing but mere property. And it essentially strips a person's personhood away, even though they never really do lose it. It's one of those things where you feed a person a lie so many time and time again, and you browbeat them with the lie that they eventually believe that it's true. And I don't think the slaves actually believed that, but it's that kind of thing that you're property. You're not a person. You're property.
Yeah. And what's interesting is also I think that people are lost on the numbers as slavery is concerned. Right now, that doesn't mean by most measures, abortion in America is the largest and greatest Holocaust, I guess you might say, genocide, someone else might say. It's the greatest number of lives snuffed out that we can ever recall in recorded human history, right? That's happening right here on American soil, under the watch of Americans and so forth, right? I am anti-abortion. Generally speaking, there are exceptions in my mind, but generally speaking, I'm anti-abortion. So my argument is not pro-abortion. My argument is with this comparison of slavery to abortion. One, slavery is, and I think where she's making a huge mistake here, is she's not really familiar, it seems, with how slavery is viewed. So one of my biggest issues with the things she had to say was that she was saying things like, black people think they're the only ones that were enslaved. And to me, that just sounds like you're bitter, about the conversation, and you haven't ever actually had a conversation with anyone black. You just maybe have heard the right-wing media and their talking points. I don't know a single black person that ever thinks that black people are the only people that were ever enslaved. I'm telling you, I've had conversations about slavery a lot. I've had it with just about everyone that I know. I don't know anyone that thinks that slavery only occurred with black people in America. The argument is that slavery in America is the most atrocious form of slavery that we've ever seen. Well, how do you mean?
Yeah. You're talking about the colonial, not even colonial, because colonialism is, I think, bar none different from imperialism, but slavery as it was practiced in the imperialistic age of the 19th century, of the 18th century, of the 16th century is just very different than the slavery that was practiced 500 years before that in Rome. a few hundred
Absolutely.
years before that in Rome. That the slow slaves could still earn their freedom. Slavery that was practiced in ancient Israel, those slaves could still get their freedom. Whereas in this one, it's just pure, unadulterated evil. You would need a benevolent owner, which is kind of ridiculous, to release you and to give you your freedom.
Yeah.
You need a gracious act from your owner to give you your freedom, and that's what makes it so wicked, bar none, compared to some of the forms of slavery that are practiced in Israel and Rome.
So just briefly, just to cover some of it, right? To paint a picture for the listener who may not be familiar, right? Because we do have listeners that are not in America, right? They may not be super familiar with the reason that slavery is such an issue in America, right? Number one, slaves were packed like sardines in the bottom of ships. When I say packed like sardines, I mean they chained them head to toe, laying on their back, and fed them through tubes most times for a multi-month journey across the ocean. Most times you would have dead, rotting carcasses that might be in the bottom of that ship because people died constantly, right? And these people would come across the water in these boats. I also want to mention that there were also often many slave revolts that happened on these ships, but they would come across this way, right? They're tied and chained on the bottom of a ship. They get to America where they are, and this is after probably other stops too, right? Because it wasn't just America, right? It was the Caribbean islands. It was Europe, right? So there was
the Americas. I mean,
slave
the Caribbean's
trade
still considered part of us.
Yeah. So the North America, South America, the islands, right? So anyway, my point is they get to America where they become the property of a person. And when I say property, I mean property. I mean, this person had to be, basically they were looked at like a cow, right? They were looked at like any other animal, right? Not like a person, like an animal. That was how they were treated under the law. You are the property of this person. This person is allowed to treat you however they want to. And if you have a baby, that baby belongs to that person. And when that baby has a baby, that baby belongs to that person. And when that baby has a baby, that baby belongs to that person. And guess what? If you as a mom have a baby and he wants to sell your baby, he can sell your baby and you'll never know that baby again. Right? If you are a married part couple and he wants to sell your husband, he'll sell your husband and there's nothing you can do about it. Right? If he decides that you did something offensive and he wants to whip you within an inch of your life, he has every right to do so. In fact, if he kills you, we won't punish him for it because ultimately you're just property. You can go back through history if you got the stomach for it and find just how violent the slave subordination process was.
Yeah, and you also think about also the wickedness of the profiteering that goes on in Africa, because I mean, some people don't think about the fact that their own kinsmen or their rival tribes, but yet still kinsmen, profiteered with the imperialistic powers that be to man steal their own kind, which flies in the face of every Pan-Africanist ideal, right? And take them to these slave trade ports and cross the Atlantic with them. I mean, just before that, the whole system of the man stealing is incredibly wicked.
Yeah, and when we talk about kinsmen and the selling and stuff, there's some misinformation there. Obviously, there were some transactions that did happen, but even in those transactions, you have to understand the context of slavery in Africa and the context of the slavery that happened in America. Oftentimes, if there was a slave exchange that happened back then, a lot of those exchanges were done under the assumption that it was more like indentured servitude, right? You take these men, I'm going to take whatever in exchange, but I'm assuming that you're going to take them and ultimately they're going to be released at some point, or they're going to be able to live a decent life at some point. They're going to have some decent standard of living. what happened ultimately is that process collapsed, and eventually you just had colonialism and people raiding the shores of Africa, armed and coming in and just stealing people. And that's important to say. So, when you talk about numbers, you know how many slaves were freed? The number of slaves that got freed in America, and people don't, like, this isn't a conversation people have, right? Like, you don't think about it. It's 4 million people, right? 4 million people were the ones that got freed after 400 years of the slave trade. How many people do you think went through that process over the course of 400 years? Right? 4 million were freed. I imagine 40 million, 50 million. Like, how many died coming across the water? Right? So when we're talking about, maybe by the numbers, but if you're strictly sticking to numbers, I can tell you several things that outweigh abortion if we're just talking numbers, right? Like you said earlier, like it'd be like comparing student loan debt, right? like I could just bring up numbers, but it's not just about the numbers. And so when you're comparing these two things, I don't think it's right to even compare them. I think abortion is wrong. But I think that in the same breath, I would never look at a woman who's been raped and say, well, you've been raped, but I mean, listen, this guy, he had his penis cut off, right? I would never do that. It speaks to an incredible lack of understanding of the experience, and it speaks to an incredible insensitivity. And I know that it's a big badge of honor over there on the right to not be sensitive to anything or anybody, but it's actually a good human trait to have empathy. And so I know you guys are snowflakes. I get it. But I mean, look, if I'm a snowflake, I won't even go there. Like it gets crazy, right? But if you're gonna like throw that around, understand that what you're espousing is being a heartless monster, essentially, right? What you're engendering and what you're endearing yourself to is, I don't have feelings. I don't actually care about my fellow man. I don't actually care. And you're only supporting the argument about how you actually feel about people that don't look like you. And I think you should rethink that if you want to consider yourself a decent human being. If you want to be counted amongst people that are looked at as decent human beings. To take the position of, I don't care how people feel about the things I say or do. And if they feel a way about it, then they are just snowflakes. And listen, you sound like a monster yourself. You sound like a pretty terrible human being, and you might want to just give that some thought. That's really my take on it, man. I don't have a whole lot more.
I can't say any on top of that. So
yeah, I just wanted to take a moment to react to that. You know, I saw it and I said, all right, well, let's throw this on the reaction episode. I like this idea. I think we should do more of these, but
yeah, you guys let us know. This is a conversation. What do you like about this conversation? Apart from my slow start and not being able to respond to Jonathan, that one is not allowed to be criticized whatsoever. I was mentally in a space that just was not able to compute. So that's my own problem with my central processing unit called my brain. But yeah, it's a conversation. We invite everyone to join us in that conversation. Let us know what you think, what we missed. Is there any nuances that you'd like to offer? Maybe there's a follow-up conversation there that you'd like to see us have, and in the future. We appreciate every last one of you, and if we would love to hear from you, then the best ways to connect with us is on Twitter, Humble Heretics 2, Instagram, TikTok, Humble Heretics. We have a Patreon, patreon.com/Humble Heretics, and a Discord server that is connected to the Patreon. So we would just love your support. We'd love to hear back from you all and continue this conversation, because that really is what life is about. It's one conversation, learning how to logically connect with people and also sympathetically / empathetically, depending on the situation and the conversation. So, can't say much more, Jonathan. We hope you all have a wonderful evening, and God bless.